It was an ordinary night, or at least it started out that way. I was in my room, absorbed in my phone, the screen's glow surrounding me when I heard a quiet knock on my door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just unusual. It was late, probably near midnight, and most of the house was still. At first, I thought I had imagined it, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. 3 soft taps, followed by the sound of the door creaking open. I looked up and saw her, my stepmom. Now, before I continue, let me give you some background. My stepmom has always been polite and friendly, but we weren't particularly close. She wasn't the type to hang out in my room, let alone sit down for a deep conversation. So, seeing her standing there in the doorway with this strange, almost hesitant expression immediately caught me off guard. Something was off and I could feel it. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I nodded, confused as she walked over to the edge of my bed and sat down carefully, as if she wasn't sure she should be there. By now, my heart was starting to race. There's something about conversations at night that makes everything feel heavier, like each word carries more significance. Still, I tried to keep my cool. "What's going on?" I asked, trying not to sound as uneasy as I felt. She paused for a long moment, just enough to make me nervous. Then, she looked straight at me with a serious, unreadable expression. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice soft but firm. Suddenly, the air in the room felt different. I stared at her, waiting. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. What could she possibly want to ask me at this hour? Was I in trouble? Did something happen to my dad? The silence stretched on until finally she said it. Something so strange that I couldn't process it at first. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. I blinked at her, trying to figure out if this was some sort of joke or if I was dreaming. But she was dead serious, and in that moment, I knew the night was about to take a very strange turn. I sat there, stunned, as my mind scrambled to make sense of what she had said. I wanted to ask her to repeat it, just to make sure I hadn't misheard. But the way she looked at me, so serious, so expectant, made it clear that this wasn't a joke. Whatever was going on, she meant it. I swallowed hard and finally found my voice. "Wait, what? Why are you asking me that?" My words came out shaky, more confused than I intended. She sighed, glancing down at her hands, which were nervously twisting together in her lap. I don't know who else to talk to about it," she said, her words slow and careful, like she was testing the waters. "I thought maybe you'd understand." "Understand?" I asked, my mind racing in every direction, trying to piece together what she meant. I felt a strange mix of emotions, nervousness, confusion, maybe even a bit of annoyance. This was my stepmom. We didn't talk much beyond the usual hey or how was your day. She was nice enough, but we weren't exactly close. Now, here she was, sitting on my bed in the middle of the night, acting as though I was the only person who could help her. "Okay," I said cautiously, still trying to act composed. "But what's really going on here? Did something happen?" She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought she might start crying. But instead she just said, "It's hard to explain." Her voice dropped lower, barely more than a whisper. "But it's been bothering me for a while now, and I need answers." I was completely lost. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The silence between us grew heavier. What did she need answers about? Why was she coming to me for them? "Does Dad know about this?" I asked. It was the only thing I could think of. She shook her head quickly. "No," she said firmly, "and I need you to promise me you won't tell him. Not yet." "Yet?" That caught me off guard even more. My dad was the steady, level-headed one in our family. He was the one you'd go to if something was wrong. So why was she keeping this from him? And why did she think I was the person to confide in? A knot tightened in my stomach. Whatever this was, it wasn't something small. My stepmom was hiding something big enough to have her sneaking into my room at midnight to talk about it. For the first time, I realized that whatever she was about to say could change everything. The room felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My stepmom looked like she was carrying a huge burden, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But I was still in the dark. I had no idea what she was about to say. "I don't know what you think I can do," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But you're freaking me out here. Just tell me what's going on." She hesitated again, biting her lip as though deciding whether to continue. "It's not something I can talk to just anyone about," she said finally. "But I think you've noticed it too." That threw me off. "Noticed what?" I blinked at her, my heart racing as memories flooded back. Small things I had dismissed before. The weird noises in the house late at night. Things disappearing and then turning up in odd places. The way my stepmom had been acting strangely these past few weeks. At the time, I had thought I was imagining it, or maybe just not paying attention. But now, sitting here with her, I realized something was definitely wrong. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "What did I notice?" She looked at me carefully, as if trying to gauge how much she could say. "You've heard the noises, haven't you? Late at night." Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. "Yeah," I admitted, trying to sound casual. "Houses make noises sometimes. It's probably nothing." She shook her head firmly. "It's not nothing. I felt it. Someone's watching me." Her voice trembled, and for the first time, I saw how scared she really was. "It's like there's something in this house that doesn't belong here." My throat went dry. I didn't know what to say. This was getting way too strange, and I wanted her to stop talking. But I also needed to hear more. "What are you saying?" I whispered, barely above a breath. She looked at me again, and the fear in her eyes made my stomach drop. "I think we're not alone here," she said, "and I think it knows we're starting to notice." I froze. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't ignore the cold shiver that ran down my spine. My stepmom's words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to shake. "We're not alone here." I wanted to laugh it off, tell her she was being paranoid, but the look on her face, so pale, so serious, made it impossible. A strange unease settled in my chest. For the first time, I really started to think about all the things I had brushed off as coincidences. The soft creaks in the hallway when no one was there. The doors that felt stuck like someone was holding them. The shadows that seemed to shift just out of view. My brain had always found explanations for those things. That's what you do, right? You tell yourself it's nothing because the alternative is too frightening. But now, sitting in the dark with my stepmom, looking at her like we were sharing a secret we didn't want to admit, I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "What am I supposed to do about it?" She looked down at her hands again, tightly clutching them together. "Because you're the only one I can talk to. Your dad won't believe me. He'll say I'm imagining things." She paused, then added, "But you're not like him. You notice things." Her words sent a chill through me. I couldn't help but glance toward my open bedroom door. The hallway beyond looked darker than usual, like the shadows were deeper somehow. I pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. "Have you seen anything?" I asked carefully, my voice barely a whisper. I almost didn't want to know the answer. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Just a glimpse. Something standing at the end of the hallway near the stairs. It was late, and when I turned on the light, it was gone." My stomach dropped. That hallway, the one right outside my room, was the same one I'd heard those noises from before. My pulse quickened as I looked at her. Did it look like a person? Her expression darkened, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I don't know. It didn't feel like a person." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that makes every creak and sound seem amplified. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I became hyper-aware of the space around me, like something was watching from the dark corner of the room. "Maybe we're just imagining it," I said quickly, desperate to break the silence. But even as I said it, I knew neither of us believed it. My stepmom didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head toward the open doorway, her eyes widening. That's when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway. The sound echoed through the house, slow and measured. My stepmom froze, her eyes locked on the door, wide with fear. My heart hammered in my chest, louder than the footsteps, each beat thumping in my ears. Someone, or something was moving just outside my room. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the steps grew louder and closer. Whoever, or whatever it was coming this way. I turned to my stepmom, my mouth dry, but she didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the doorway, her face pale and rigid. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She nodded, her lips trembling, and finally whispered back, "It's happening again. We're not safe here." My stomach tightened, my breath quickening. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The steps paused right outside the door, and for a moment there was complete silence. My pulse raced in my ears, drowning out everything else. The room felt smaller, darker, suffocating. I glanced at my stepmom. Her face was a mask of terror. She was biting her lips so hard I could see the tension in her jaw. Then, without warning, the door handle rattled. Once, sharp and sudden. I froze, staring at it, willing it not to move. But it did. The door creaked open, and a shadow filled the doorway. I jumped back, my heart in my throat as a figure stepped into the room. It wasn't a person. Not really. Not in the way I expected. The figure was tall, dark, almost like it was made of shadow itself. Its edges were blurry, shifting as though it didn't quite belong in this world. It seemed to stretch, grow, then shrink, constantly changing shape. My breath caught in my throat and my mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped by the darkness filling the room. I glanced at my stepmom, who was shaking now, her hand covering her mouth. "Don't look at it," she whispered urgently, her voice barely more than a breath. I couldn't help it. My eyes were glued to the figure in the doorway, and despite my fear, something was pulling me toward it. I needed to understand it. I needed to know what it was. The figure shifted again, its form warping as it moved forward. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Something human. A face, or at least the faint outline of one, staring back at me. But it wasn't right. The eyes were dark, empty, as if they could pierce through me into my very soul. Suddenly, the air around us thickened, becoming dense like it was harder to breathe. I coughed, trying to clear the strange pressure in my chest, but it only grew heavier. I looked at my stepmom again, and her eyes were wide with terror. "It's here," she gasped, her voice shaky. "It knows we're onto it." I didn't know what she meant, but the fear in her eyes made something click in my mind. This wasn't just some random event. This thing, whatever it was, had been in this house for a long time. Watching, waiting. Then, as if the air itself was trembling, the figure took another step forward, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Every part of me screamed to run, but I was frozen in place. Suddenly, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. The room was silent again, except for the frantic beat of my heart. I stared at the empty doorway, still expecting it to reappear, but it didn't. Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My stepmom didn't answer right away. She was still staring at the door, her face pale, and slowly shook her head. "It's not gone," she whispered. "It's still here and it knows who we are." The air felt heavy with dread. The tension between us was suffocating, and I could feel something dark building up in my stomach. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with us yet. The silence in the room became unbearable, and I gasped for breath, my eyes fixed on the doorway, expecting the dark figure to return. But it didn't. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every creak in the house felt like a warning. I glanced at my stepmom, who seemed just as frozen as I was, her eyes darting nervously between the door and me. "It's not gone," she whispered again, her voice shaking. "It's waiting, we have to leave." I nodded, my heart pounding. I knew she was right. We couldn't stay here. But the thought of moving, of leaving my room and stepping into that hallway again, felt impossible. What if that thing was still out there? What if it was waiting for us to make a move? Slowly, I stood up, my legs shaky, and reached for the door. The instant my hand touched the handle, a cold rush of air hit me, and I heard it. A soft, whispering sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if someone was murmuring my name. I turned back to my stepmom, but she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me. "Don't," she whispered. "Whatever you do, don't look behind you." My blood ran cold. My body screamed at me to turn around and see what terrified her, but I couldn't. I forced myself to stay still, gripping the door handle as tightly as I could. Then it happened. A low, guttural laugh filled the room. It was deep, unnatural, and it seemed to come from everywhere all at once. My stepmom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there it was, standing right behind me. The figure. It was taller now, its shape more defined, more menacing. But this time it wasn't just a shadow. I could see the outline of its face, or at least what was left of it. Its eyes were hollow black holes that seemed to pull me in, and its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, a smile no human could ever make. My stepmom's voice broke through my daze. "We have to leave now," she shouted, grabbing my arm. I didn't need more convincing. We bolted for the door, but as soon as I reached it, it slammed shut with a deafening thud. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The thing behind me let out another laugh. This time, louder, closer. And then, in an instant, the room plunged into darkness. I screamed, my voice swallowed by the pitch black. My stepmom's hand was still on my arm, but I couldn't see anything. The only sound was that laugh, growing louder and louder, until it felt like it was echoing inside my head. Just as I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, the light flickered on, blinding me for a moment. I blinked, trying to adjust, and then everything was gone. The figure, the darkness, everything. The door swung open easily. I stumbled out, gasping for air, but the hallway was empty. No shadow, no figure, just a quiet, empty house. I turned to my stepmom, still holding my arm. What just happened?" I gasped. She shook her head, her face pale like a ghost. "We shouldn't have tried to face it," she whispered. "I don't understand." "Face it? What do you mean?" I asked. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, regret. "It was never supposed to leave the attic," she murmured, her voice barely audible. My heart stopped. The attic. That's where it had been all along. And now it was free. Before I could say anything, I heard it. A soft scratching noise coming from above. The attic door creaked open on its own, and I realized with sickening certainty that it was just getting started. The scratching grew louder, sharper, and I knew with growing dread that whatever had been hiding in the attic was making its way down. My stepmom's grip tightened on my arm and her face twisted in panic. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already free." I could barely breathe. The thought of facing that thing again, after everything we had just been through, was terrifying. But something inside me snapped. We couldn't let it win. We couldn't let it take over our lives. "Where's your dad?" I asked, still trying to catch my breath. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze flickered toward the attic door, which was beginning to tremble, as if something inside was pushing against it. "He's at work," she said finally, her voice shaking. "But it's not him that's the problem. It's the house, the curse. Whatever it is, it's tied to this place." I took a deep breath, gathering whatever courage I had left. "Then we need to finish this now." My stepmom nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We need to go to the attic. That's where it started." Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this house as possible. But the thought of leaving everything behind, my family, the house, didn't sit right with me. We couldn't run forever. If we didn't stop it now, it would only grow stronger,